Okay.
Hi, everybody. It's Tammy. Welcome to our Sunday Stay at Home series. And I am so excited for you to be here tonight. We have Dr. Margery Marcus, and she's going to be talking about censored cinema. Can everybody see me okay and hear me? Okay. All right, because everybody else is going to be muted. So thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, I want you to go ahead and send me a note in the chat and or you can unmute yourself afterwards for any questions. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Marcus.
Hello, everyone. And you can see behind me that one way or the other, I'm at Gleneagles. So thank you for having me and welcome to Censored Cinema for Adults Only. And you probably have to admit it, you came in thinking you were going to see some dirty pictures, didn't you? Well, I'm not going to disappoint you. Of course, they're dirty by the standards of the 1920s and 30s. But anyway, I am going to be, just give me a minute. I'm a little bit frozen here. Okay. There we go. All right, here we go. So today I'm going to be talking about the very first kind of films. Then I'm going to be talking about Hollywood scandals that led to the Hollywood Production Code and all of that censorship. And then we're going to look at some of the major problems affecting films today. So when I think about Thomas Edison, I think light bulb. But Thomas Edison explored so many different areas, and he actually developed one of the earliest film projectors. He called it the kinetoscope, and he thought it was a toy. And here is one of those kinetoscopes from the early 1890s. And you can see that gentleman looking into it, watching a film that was anywhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. And the most famous of these kinetoscope films was actually watching somebody sneeze. But you can see that obviously there was a problem with the kinetoscope. Only one person at a time could watch. So several years later, what is out there but Edison's greatest marvel, the vitascope? But the problem was that it wasn't really Edison's model. The two men who invented the vitascope, which would allow hundreds of people in a giant theater to see a movie, those two men needed funding. And they approached Edison and asked him for money. And Edison said, I will gladly give you what you need, but you have to credit me with inventing this great marvel. So Edison didn't actually invent it. He just got the credit for it. But he ran into all kinds of trouble. In 1896, on the giant screen, he had what is known as the kiss, the very first kiss on screen. While some people were delighted, others were horrified. The Catholic Church called for police interference. Well, it wasn't too long ago that Edison's inventions became so popular that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania became the film capital of the United States for a very short period of time. And if there's anybody out there from Pittsburgh, and I bet there is, you well know the Nickelodeon Theater, the very first theater called the Nickelodeon because it only cost a nickel to get in. And for 1 nickel, you could see up to 5 films in a 15-minute period. And again, wildly popular, except some religious groups were very concerned that men and women were intermingling in the dark, and they thought this was totally scandalous. Well, a few years later, Chicago got the honor of having the very first board of censors. People were very concerned that these films were somehow offending society's morale and morals. So the idea in Chicago was that studios would submit their films to the board of censors, and the censors would literally snip out what they didn't like. And what happened to those clips? Well, it turned out that the president of the board of censors gathered the clips together, spliced them, and invited his friends over to watch these censored movie clips. And in 1915, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision. It was called the Mutual Film Corporation versus Ohio. Mutual Film sued the state of Ohio. The state of Ohio was levying heavy taxes and a good deal of censorship on films. And Mutual Film said, we are protected by the First Amendment. We are an art form. And the Supreme Court said, no, you are not. Motion pictures are commercial businesses, not entitled to protection under the First Amendment. And that ruling stood for 40 years. And at the same time that Mutual Films is fighting, scandals in Hollywood are piling up. And probably one of the most famous scandals is the Fatty Arbuckle scandal. And the year is 1921. And there is the great comedy star, Fatty Arbuckle's booking picture. Now, Fatty Arbuckle, whose real name was Roscoe, was the biggest name in films in the teens and in the early 1920s. He earned more money than any other Hollywood star. And Fatty Arbuckle was also one of these actors who was so giving of his time and his support. He discovered and gave his first break to the actor, the comedian Buster Keaton, and there they are in a film clip. And he gave Charlie Chaplin many opportunities as well to star with him. But Fatty Arbuckle ran into trouble when he hosted a wild party in a San Francisco hotel. And one young woman was found drugged in her hotel room, taken to the hospital, and she died. Her roommate said that Fatty Arbuckle drugged and raped her. Well, you could imagine the publicity that this trial occurred. It would be like our trying George Clooney for something awful like this. And you can see the headline, Arbuckle faces the gallows. It was an acquittal on the third trial. And interestingly, Buster Keaton testified on behalf of Fatty Arbuckle. And when Arbuckle was acquitted, of course, his career was in shambles. He had no money. And Buster Keaton gave Arbuckle 25% of all of Keaton's earnings from that time forward to show his gratitude. But Arbuckle's scandal was not bad enough. One of the greatest, most famous, most beloved screen actors of the 1920s, a fellow by the name of Wallace Reid, was found dead from a drug overdose. He was considered the screen's most perfect lover. And if that wasn't bad enough, William Desmond Taylor, a very, very well-known and well-respected director, now we're talking silent films here, director of silent films, was found dead in his Hollywood bungalow. And to this day, we have no idea who killed Taylor. And you can see in this announcement in the Evening Herald, mystery gunman kills film director Taylor. Arbuckle jurors still held up. And if this wasn't bad enough, America's sweetheart, Mary Pickford, is caught having a torrid love affair with Douglas Fairbanks, who is married. This made huge news Detectives followed Pickford and Fairbanks wherever they went. Finally, Douglas Fairbanks divorced his wife, married Mary Pickford in 1920, and they were divorced 13 years later. So at this point, church leaders are calling for action. Clean up the movie business. A St. Louis rabbi backed the Catholic Church's Legion of Decency. A federal takeover of movies loomed. So the movie industry decided to clean up its own act. And they hired this fellow, William Hayes, and you can see in that editorial cartoon on the right, there's Hayes, and he is cleaning up the movie picture industry. So Hayes was a very well respected member of the Republican Party. He had been Postmaster General of the United States. He'd been chairman of the Republican Party of Ohio, and he takes on this job of heading up the Motion Picture Association of America and cleaning up the movies. And here's another cartoon. There's the motion picture industry screaming, help me, and Hayes is going to dive right in. So he takes the job and he comes up with the idea of making a list of what he called the don'ts of the movie business, because he figured if I publish a list of don'ts, then all the studios are going to know what not to do, and we will not have any more problems. So he was very naive. And here are some of his don'ts. He said there can be no profanity in film by title, remember, silent films, by title or lip, because as we know, the actors lip read much of the dialogue. There could be no suggestive nudity and certainly no scenes of childbirth. And in the very same year that this list of don'ts came out, the very first talkie also appeared. It was Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. And people in the Catholic Church said, silent smut is bad, but vocal smut is worse. And these two men decided to do something about it. The first gentleman, the one on the left, his name was Martin Quigley, and he was very influential. He was the editor of a trade paper called the Motion Picture Herald. And he joined forces with the Jesuit priest, Father Daniel Lord. And between the two of them, they put together a code to govern the making of motion pictures, which we now call the Hollywood Production Code or the Hays Code. And they brought this work of theirs to Hayes, who said, this is perfect. It is exactly what I've been looking for. And Quigley said that the basis of this code was the 10 Commandments, a standard of morality throughout the civilized world. And in 1930, the code was published in Variety magazine, and everyone was supposed to abide by it. But it didn't exactly start out that way. The years between 1930 and 1934 in Hollywood are called pre-code Hollywood. The code was in effect, but nobody was paying very much attention to it. For instance, the very first film that got a seal of approval by the code people was The Blue Angel, 1930. And this film outraged the Catholic Church. So the film starred Marlene Dietrich, almost new to the cinema, a beautiful young starlet, and Emil Jannings. Now, Jannings, fascinating fellow. Jannings won the very first Oscar ever awarded for acting. So he was a very big name, and they were both German. And The Blue Angel was filmed in Germany in both English and German. It was a talkie, of course. And they bring it over to this country, and it's wildly popular. It's about a very conservative German professor, that's Jannings, who falls madly in love with Marlene Dietrich, who plays a chanteuse named Lola Lola. And he falls so madly in love with her that he falls into sexual degradation. And he marries her and almost becomes an animal. The movie was wildly popular. Jannings goes back to Germany, and Jannings makes a very bad decision. He throws his lot in with the fascists. He starts making Nazi propaganda films. Marlene Dietrich stayed in this country for a while. So Jannings is making Nazi propaganda films. And when the liberation comes and the American troops are coming through Berlin, Jannings runs up to them holding his Oscar to prove what a loyal member of the cinema he was to American values. Well, it didn't help him at all. And his career was completely gone. So this was the first film that got censorship approval. Another film was Mae West's She Done Him Wrong. And of course, in this film, she stars with a very, very young Cary Grant. And this film also has that very famous line, "Why don't you come up sometime and see me?" West was a really a brilliant woman. She had written a play called Diamond Lil, which was very successful on Broadway. And She Done Him Wrong was Diamond Lil adapted to film. And at first, the censors didn't want to give it any kind of approval at all. And then they said, okay, we will let you go ahead. We'll let the theater show the film if you delete all references to the word diamond, and we're not allowing you to publicize the movie in any way. It didn't matter. It was still very popular. But the nail in the coffin of pre-code Hollywood was this film. It's called Convention City. The year is 1934. Recognize Adolphe Menjou, and that is a very young Mary Astor and Joan Blondell. And the plot of this film was really smarmy. Adolphe Menjou plays a businessman at a convention in Atlantic City. And he bets one of his buddies that he can bed the two young women here who are his boss's daughters. Well, the movie was so bad that Jack Warner himself ordered it burned, but it was too late. The Catholic Church took to the streets. They formed the Catholic Legion of Decency in 1934. They are demanding decent movies. And when 10 million Catholics swear that they're not going to a movie that doesn't have the church's seal of approval, Hollywood paid attention. And you can see in that drawing on the right, nudity, narcotics, brutality, divorce, these are all reprehensible and totally forbidden by the Catholic Church. And if you were a member of the Legion of Decency, you had to take a pledge. I hereby promise to remain away from all motion pictures except those which do not offend decency and Christian morality. So in 1934, pre-code Hollywood is done, and now we're going to be seriously censored. And a fellow by the name of Joseph Breen is brought in by William Hayes, and he is going to head up the Production Code Administration. And he said, the vulgar, the cheap, and the tawdry are out. And they came up with a certificate. It was a stamp of approval that a film would get, and this picture is approved by the Production Code Administration. And if a theater showed a film that did not have the stamp of approval, the theater got a $25,000 fine. So all of the theaters and all of the movie studios were lining up to do the right thing, or to at least get their films made. The very first film censored after pre-code Hollywood was one of the Tarzan films. It's Tarzan and his mate. And you can actually go onto Google and Google this, and you would see scenes of Jane swimming naked. And those scenes were cut when the film was released. Do you recognize this person? It's a cartoon character. She looks half human, half French poodle. This is her very first cartoon. It was a wildly popular series of cartoons made for Talkatoon. Well, if you have any idea who this person morphed into, look no further. Betty Boop. So before the censors got a hold of Betty Boop, she's wearing that little sort of racy strapless dress showing off her figure. The censor said, suggestive immorality, and they made her put on a dress to the knees. But no one drove those censors crazier than the production staff of Gone with the Wind. 1939, turned out to be, of course, a blockbuster film that we all have watched many times and we all have loved, but we know that there were lots of problems with the censors with Gone with the Wind. And one of them was Melanie giving birth to her first child. We know that she died in childbirth with the second child, but here she is giving birth to her first child. I think it was a son, tended by Scarlett. Breen himself got involved with Gone with the Wind, and he was very, very concerned that a realistic portrayal of childbirth could undermine the glory of motherhood. And he ordered that Melanie could not moan or loudly groan in labor. And if we remember that scene, she does give birth to a baby, but it's sort of behind, it's in shadows behind a screen. But this, of course, is the most famous example of the battle between the production company and the Hays Code people. And I hope you can hear it. It's a little bit low. It's as high as I can get it. But this is the very famous scene. You can probably quote it by heart. So let's take a look.
Red! Red! You go. Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
There he goes. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. 6 months it took for the studio to convince Breen that Clark Gable could say, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And the argument that finally swayed him was, damn, without God in front of it, was merely vulgar, not profane. So now we have that, probably some of the most famous lines in film history. In the early 1940s, along comes Casablanca. Look how just young and beautiful these actors are. The only person on that set who was happy was Ingrid Bergman. She was a beautiful young star, and this was a great opportunity for her to work with both Humphrey Bogart and Paul Henreid. Humphrey Bogart was miserable during the entire filming of Casablanca. Why? He was 2 inches shorter than Ingrid Bergman, and in every scene where he's standing with her, he's either standing on a box or sitting on a pillow. And Paul Henri, who plays the freedom fighter Victor Laszlo, was furious because he felt he should have top billing. He had just come off very great success in Now Voyager with Bette Davis. So the two men did not get along, were not happy. And the censors weren't very happy either. So they made a deal, of course, with the studio, with the writers, only one or two hells. They wanted Ilsa's husband to be dead. Well, of course, if Ilsa's husband's dead, there's no story. It's all about Rick trying to help her husband escape from Casablanca. But they cut out entirely the fact that Ilsa and Rick had had an affair in Paris when Ilsa thought Victor was dead, and they had a son, and that is all gone from the film. This clip that I'm going to show you, and again, I think you'll get the idea if you can't hear it that well, is considered to be one of the most emotion-packed segments in Hollywood history. It is the singing of the French national anthem in Rick's club to drown out the German soldiers who are singing some kind of German patriotic song. And before I show it to you, I'm just going to tell you why it's considered to be so moving. Because the extras singing on the set were German refugees who managed to get out of Europe just before the walls came down, and they were able to flee to Hollywood, and they were used as extras in this scene.
Played.
So that scene was actually removed from the film when it was released in Germany after the war in 1952. There's the poster from Germany, Casablanca, 3 Academy Awards. 25 minutes were deleted from this film. That famous and moving French national anthem theme was deleted. And the film was changed from Ilsa's husband escaping from jail rather than a concentration camp. So the whole film was watered down, but about 12 years later, it was shown again throughout Europe in its original format. You probably know this famous story of Jane Russell and her bra. So in the early 1940s, Howard Hughes is doing two things at once. He's building aircraft for the war effort, and he's designing a bra to show off Jane Russell's bust in his film, The Outlaw. And he designs this contraption with iron and wires, and it's supposed to give her a very soft and natural look. Jane Russell later admitted she could not wear that contraption that Hughes developed. It was much too uncomfortable. So she hitched up her own bra, stuffed it with tissue paper, and there you have Jane Russell's beautiful body there. So the film was released, and then the censor said, "What in the world are we doing?" And they pulled its certificate of approval, and it wasn't shown again until the early 1950s. And you may remember it's a black and white film, the story of Billy the Kid. So in the 1950s, we have a lot of to do with a streetcar named Desire. Now, 1951, Tennessee Williams won a Pulitzer for his play, A Streetcar Named Desire, starring On Broadway, a new young talent that nobody had ever heard of, Marlon Brando. So Marlon Brando made it to the screen version. You see him here with Vivian Leigh. Well, as you probably remember, at the end of A Streetcar Named Desire, Marlon Brando character, Stanley, while his wife, Stella, is in the hospital giving birth to their child, Stanley rapes Stella's sister, Blanche, played by Vivian Leigh. He sends her over the edge. She's mentally unstable to begin with. At the end of the film, she's carted off, and that's when she turns to her medical staff and says, I've always depended upon the kindness of strangers. And in the original play, Stella stays with Stanley, but the writers refused to cut the rape scene, and a compromise was met. The rape scene was allowed, but Tennessee Williams himself wrote a new ending for the play. So the original ending is Stella stays with Stanley. In the film, she leaves him because she is not going to stay with the man who raped her husband. So that was the compromise. In Hollywood now, in 1952, we have the tabloid Confidential magazine. And the tabloid just loved to play up the sex lives of the movie stars. And here's why Frank Sinatra is the Tarzan of the boudoir, because he eats his Wheaties. Evidently, one of his lovers told Confidential magazine that when she spent the night with Frank Sinatra, he would get up occasionally from their lovemaking, have a bowl of Wheaties, and come back to bed. So Confidential magazine had quite the stories there. Confidential magazine took pleasure in outing celebrities. They outed Marlene Dietrich as bisexual. And this particular issue of Confidential magazine was actually banned in California. Picture of Liberace, and it says on the front, his theme song should be, I'm mad about the boy. And finally, in 1942, 40 years after the Mutual Films Corporation ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that movies are an art form entitled to First Amendment protection. And this was really the beginning of the end of the censorship code. And Otto Preminger decided he was going to take a stand. So he submits the movie, The Moon is Blue, to the censors, to the Film Censoring Board, the PCA. And the censors say, you have to take out the word virgin, the word seduce, and the word pregnant. And Otto Preminger says, no way. He leaves those words in the film. The theaters show the film. The film is wildly popular. He doesn't even submit his next films to the censorship board. So you can see that the censorship board is losing its clout. In 1956, Breen retires, and his replacement is a much more relaxed kind of guy. So in 1956, the code says adultery, prostitution, and profanity are now allowed. And I don't know if you remember this movie, Baby Doll. I remember it, also written by Tennessee Williams. So Time magazine said that Baby Doll is just possibly the dirtiest American-made motion picture ever legally exhibited because it had the PCA stamp of approval. It was about a young woman who's about 17 who marries a farmer much older than she is and has an affair with one of the ranch hands. The thing that I remember most about this film is it gave us the word baby doll pajamas because Carol Baker spends most of the film in her little baby dolls. 1959, the Catholic League of Decency is losing its clout. They were furious that Some Like It Hot, in which Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon play cross-dressers, and there's Marilyn Monroe in all her, beautiful glory there. They got the stamp of approval. But Billy Wilder played it fast and loose with the censor board. Billy Wilder only submitted parts of the script. So the censors approved what they saw, but were horrified when they actually saw the movie. Too late. The movie was wildly popular. I remember this, La Dolce Vita, the 1960s. This film was not censored in the United States, but it was censored in Italy. And the last straw in film censorship was 1966, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And if you remember this, you probably do. Elizabeth Taylor, married to Richard Burton, play George and Martha. George is a college professor. Martha is his very depressed alcoholic wife. They invite a young couple, two people, to their home. One is George Siegel plays a professor, not tenured yet, and his wife. And Taylor and Burton go to it. They start drinking. It gets ugly. The curses just run fast and furious. But the production code is now bargaining with the film writers. So, okay, we're going to take out the word screw, but we're going to leave hump the hostess. Elizabeth Taylor, by the way, was paid more than any other actor at the time, including her own husband, for this, and obviously won an Academy Award for. If you've never seen this, it's worth seeing. Very powerful, but very, very salty language, but got the stamp of approval. So along comes this fellow, Jack Valenti, and he was an advisor to President Johnson. He has a fascinating background. He was an Air Force pilot, very well connected politically. He is asked to take over the Motion Picture Association of America and do something to get a handle on film censorship. So Valenti comes up with this idea of a ratings guide. We're not going to ask the studios to submit films for a censorship board, but we're going to get a panel of people and we're going to show them these films and they are going to rate the films. A G is going to be for general audiences, and an M for mature audiences, and an R, children must be under 16 accompanied by a parent, and an X. So an X means only adults 18 and over. And now every film had a rating and people could decide for themselves what they wanted to see based on the ratings. And the R rating was very, very big news. And it was a boon to the motion picture industry, because if a child who's under 16 wanted to see a film, he had to convince his parents to take them. So that was 2 tickets for every teenager. And then with the X rating, wildly popular, you remember this film, Midnight Cowboy is the only X-rated film to win 3 Oscars. And I remember it as a very, very powerful film. That's Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman. And let's talk about the X rating. The porn industry loved the X rating. So they decided to pile on the X's. And we're going to have X and XX, and we're going to have triple X. And the X would ultimately be replaced with the NC-17 much later. So now we have the 1970s, the era of porn chic with our X-rated movies. So you may remember this. I sort of do. It came out of Sweden. It came to this country. I Am Curious Yellow. It was the first mainstream movie with full nudity. Roger Ebert, the critic, said this was so boring, 2 hours of nudity. And I think I agreed with him. And then along comes the actress Linda Lovelace. So Linda Lovelace has ideas of being, the next great Hollywood star, a serious star. So I don't know what she was thinking when she married a porn film producer, and there they are, Chuck Trainer, and he stars her in Deep Throat. To this day, Deep Throat is the largest selling, highest grossing mainstream pornography film ever made. So Linda Lovelace was the girl next door who starred in the most famous adult film of all time. And you can see I have a red arrow pointing to the X, and the playbill there showed how far does a girl have to go to untangle her tingle. Well, it turned out that Linda Lovelace in her autobiography said that she was really bullied and harassed by her husband, who she divorced, into making this film. And she testified against pornographic films in front of Congress, and she died much too young. So Linda Lovelace divorces her husband, who goes on to marry Marilyn Chambers. So Marilyn Chambers, some of us remember as the Ivory Snow Girl. And I remember all of these Ivory Snow commercials on TV, and this, innocent little Marilyn Chambers holding up this box of Ivory Snow for babies. And she stars in the X-rated film Behind the Green Door. And it was another blockbuster as X-rated films go. So when we look at X-rated films, films today are, one of the problems is the R-rated film. So President Trump said a few years ago, you see these movies and they're so violent, and maybe they should put out a rating system for that. But of course, they have a rating system for that. These films are R-rated. And going back to the 1960s, we have Bonnie and Clyde. And Bonnie and Clyde opened the floodgates for violence in film. And that very last scene of Bonnie and Clyde, where they are machine gunned in the car and the bullets are flying all over their bodies, very, very hard to watch. In fact, when Bonnie and Clyde was first shown in this country, it was not well received at all. It was sent over to Europe. It was quite a hit in Europe. And when it came back here, then word of mouth was spreading and it became much, much popular. So we still talk about violence today. And one of the films that the film industry, they were concerned about, not enough to do anything about it, was The Joker. And you may have seen this. I think I might have seen it on Prime or Netflix. Very powerful film. But the film was late in release because there was fear of copycat violence. Very, very violent film, if you recall. However, that didn't stop it from having the biggest October debut in history. And Joaquin Phoenix won an Oscar for his role, but very, very brutal. And this particular film was pulled back because of mass shootings in Texas and Ohio 2 years ago. Finally, so it was supposed to debut in May. It originally debuted in the fall. Very dark film about wealthy blue state liberals who invite some red state conservative Americans to a hunting lodge and then go hunting them. Just very, very difficult for me to watch. So the second problem facing studios today is the problem of promoting racial stereotypes And Disney in particular has faced this problem. So on the Disney Channel, if you're going to sit with your grandchildren and watch Dumbo or Aladdin, before the film comes on, you're going to see a disclaimer. And the disclaimer says that these stereotypes were wrong then and are wrong now. So what are the stereotypes? So Dumbo has a stereotype of crows that are black minstrels. The Aristocats has a stereotype of Asians. Aladdin shows people from the Middle East as being violent and bloodthirsty, and Peter Pan is offensive to Native Americans. But you can see these 4 films on television and in the movies. What you can't see is Song of the South. And we remember that, that's the Uncle Remus story. And Song of the South has been completely banned, and you can't find it anywhere, or maybe you can if you look good and hard. But you're not going to see it on TV, and you're not going to see it in a movie because of offensive depiction of happy slaves singing in the fields. But Disney's problems go way back to 1934 and a problem with Porky and Petunia. And when Porky and Petunia, the cartoon, first was submitted to the censors, Porky and Petunia were kissing. The censors cut that right out, and then Porky and Petunia could only hold hands and dance. And the Production Code Administration also had guidelines for Flossie the cow. And they said that cows in Mickey Mouse or other cartoons will from now on have small or invisible udders. And you can see before 1934, there's Flossie, and she has a pretty good udders on her. And after 1934, Flossie is wearing a skirt. So I will thank you for being an utterly terrific audience, if you don't mind my really bad pun there. And I really appreciate you having me in your homes on Zoom. And I'm going to take my screen down and answer any questions or hear any comments that you may have. And there you all are. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Can you believe Porky Pig and Betty Boop? Who would have thought?
Can you believe it? Yep. And I love that you picked up Betty Boop in the screen behind you. That's so great. We're really on the same path there. That's great.
There's so much history. Before I start asking questions, I will open it up to our membership. You can unmute yourself, raise your hand, say something in the chat. But if is there anybody? I'll ask a question. Maybe that'll get some.
Okay.
Oh, my
thinking
God.
going. Oh, yes, ma'am. Mrs. Mendelson?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it was interesting to me to see the film, the German film, I think it was, or the French film where they were singing.
Casablanca, right.
Correct. Well, it's a very long story, but are you familiar with Görlitz, Germany, which is now referred to as Gorleywood?
No.
Okay,
Tell us.
So my father was born there, and Görlitz is on the border of Poland and Germany. It's the most furthest eastern city in Germany, and it was not damaged severely during the war. It has 4,000 buildings of various magnificent architecture, and Inglourious Basterds was filmed there.
Oh.
Wait, I got to come up with, the Grand Budapest Hotel was filmed there.
Wow.
when I was there last November, they were filming, I don't remember whether it was a movie or probably a film, a series for TV. There are other movies that were also filmed there. I just can't remember it. But you might be interested in checking into
Thank
that.
you. That's great.
Really, the buildings are amazing, and they take you back to the 30s, the 20s, okay, the early 1900s, and they are magnificent. So the city, it's the small city, and it gets filled with actors and all these fabulous cars, and it brings money, of course, into the city, and people stay there. So it sort of reminded me, wow, here we are in
Yeah.
2022.
Do you know if they use that film for Nazi propaganda movies? That's particular city?
I don't know. That's a good question. I have to ask someone about that. I
Would you
will.
spell the name of that city? I'm going to write it down.
Sure. It's Gorlitz.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's why I love these audiences. I learn as much
Well,
from
I
you.
really enjoyed
you.
your presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank
Usually,
you.
thank you. You're a good lecturer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, she is. Anybody else have a question? While you're thinking of one final, see, my question, I have two questions. So there's I guess if you want to explain the difference about erasing a problem of content versus censorship. And that's my first question, is that there are movies right now or states that are erasing certain parts of films, and some people are, and just like explain the difference if you can, like between that and it's not really censorship. So
You know, it's so interesting that you ask. When I was live at Gleneagles, oh gosh, I guess about a year ago, maybe, my topic was book censorship,
yes,
which in some ways is very much aligned to film censorship. So that's, to me, is interesting. And in book censorship, we have the idea of a film or a book or a film, really, the difference between it being challenged and being censored. So if a film is challenged, it means the League of Decency, for instance, they didn't like it, they want it gone, they tell people not to watch it, but they can't make it disappear. But if a film or a book is censored, it is gone. For instance, Song of the South, it's gone. You can't see it, you can't find it, it is gone. But you can take some of the other Disney movies that I talked about, and they may be changed a little bit, or there's a disclaimer for it. So it may be considered censored, but it's still out there. So if a film is out there, it's not really censored, because censored means, for the most part, gone, out. And in this country, you know, we look at these films and books too, and we allow people, for the most part, to decide whether they want to read it or not read it. And actually, I'm working on a new lecture called Florida's Book Wars, because getting into all the problems in education with books and book banning and culture wars and all of that. So films are all a part of that big picture.
My second question is, or maybe another lecture, or I mean, this would be kind of fun for myself to do, like for a Tech Tuesday, is that you have the film ratings, and now everything is streamed. So, I mean, you have R rated, you have violence, you have PG, and not everybody, I mean, you can't keep there's only certain ways that you can keep kids from watching these films,
Right.
you know, unless if you're technical savvy, you can go onto Netflix and put up the subtitles and,
Right.
you know, or download an app and things like that. So it's almost like the rating system, thanks to this, or what's your view of the streaming? And all of a sudden now the rating system is like everybody, you know, it's not like it was before.
The rating system, you know, kids want to see a movie, they're going to see a movie. They're going to figure out how to get into a movie. They're going to figure out how to download a movie. Kids are all smarter than we are. And parent controls are fine when kids are little. But as the kids get older and they get savvier, they can get around the controls. I mean, my grandchildren, 14 and 15, they can out-tech me, all over the place. But what concerns me really almost more than movies are the video games that I see children playing. And that to me is a great concern. And as far as I know, there's very little censorship going on in the world of video games. And the violence that you see makes the violence in the Joker look like nothing. And I don't know if any of you are out there and have grandchildren who play those games, and if that's ever been a concern to you, but it certainly has been a concern to me.
That is an amazing point. I don't play those video games, but I see them and it's just like, it's so realistic. It's raw.
Yes, very realistic and very, very violent. And kids get, and adults too, desensitized. 40 people are killed in a video game. The kid goes, oh, well, kind of thing. Yeah, that's a real problem as well, I think.
That's enough from my questions. Anybody, the title bound, hang on, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Just hit your red microphone. I can't hear you yet. The title, Stanley, title bound, we still can't hear you.
Mute.
Hover, there
There
you go.
they go.
This is Sylvia talking. Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was lovely, very informative.
Thank you.
But let me segue. You're just talking about children. One of the films that strike me as rather relevant is Lolita. And I wondered why that didn't come up, because it really fits in with tech and the sophistication of the young children being exposed to TikTok and all the other venues. Has that been a film that you've considered in your presentation?
Do you mean Lolita the film?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I did deal with it. Of course, you weren't there, but I deal with that in my book Censorship. I talk about the censoring of the film Lolita, the censoring of the book. And then if I remember the film, I was much younger, of course, but the girl who played Lolita was 14 years old.
That's right.
And that we were sort of horrified by that at the time. But yeah, that movie ran into lots of trouble too, but it did get out there. It had distribution. I don't remember the year. I would have to go back in my notes, but obviously the code by the time Lolita came along was weakening. Shelley Winters, James Mason, I'm thinking, does that sound about right?
Yeah, James Mason, yeah.
Do you remember, was the film rather tame?
No.
And not showing? No, it was not tame. Okay,
No.
It was
thank
creepy.
you.
It was creepy.
Creepy. Stan says it was creepy, but I think
Thank you for that
Nine-
comment, though.
I
They
think
said Lolita, there's a couple of them. There was one in 1962 and another one released in 1977 and 1950. And the book, I guess, was 1955.
Right, so I'm thinking of that early 1960s film.
All right, well, anybody else
Thank
have
you.
any questions?
Yes, I do.
oh,
Oh, sure.
How frequently are films censored based on current moral standards, which were very popular and acceptable at the time? For example, I'm thinking of the Jolson Story, which was probably the best film of 1946 or 1947, totally racial. Were films like that ever subsequently censored?
Censored by states, communities. I don't think it was any kind of a federal censorship, but films, theaters are free to play what they want to play. And if there's something at work that's going to make a theater say, I'm not going to play that film, certainly. One of the most censored films was Birth of the Nation. Back in the I'm going to guess 1914. It was a silent film back then. So that was heavily censored by region of the country for the most part. So I think that sometimes censorship is local. Certainly we're seeing censorship on a local level now. in schools as far as this very hot topic of book censorship. And film censorship goes right along with that too, but it's a really good, thoughtful question.
Thank you.
I wish I had answers. You know, so many of these questions are terrific to, you know, talk about and think about. And sometimes we get frustrated in disagreeing about what should be censored or what shouldn't be censored. Personally, I think all of this violence and these violent video games should be censored, but they're not.
Everybody, I'm just going to stop the recording. Thank you all. Where's my little stop button?